The HOA president in my neighborhood, a woman everyone quietly called Karen, had a reputation for controlling everything from the color of mailboxes to when you could water your lawn. But when she decided to make an example out of me, she didn't realize she'd picked the wrong neighbor. Her power trip went too far the day she tried to intimidate me at a meeting I never agreed to attend. She thought she could threaten, shame, and call the cops to prove a point, but she had no idea I'm the new police chief in charge. What happens when someone tries to abuse authority against the one person who understands the law better than anyone else? Keep watching, because this story doesn't end the way she expected. Before everything spiraled into chaos, life in Lake Ranch Estates felt like the perfect version of suburban peace. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a lake that shimmered golden at sunset made it look like something out of a brochure. I'd only lived there for 6 months, having recently transferred to the town's police department as its new chief. My wife and I were thrilled. We thought this community to be a quiet place to settle down after years of working long shifts and moving between stations. Our home sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac, overlooking the water. It was modest but well-kept, a white, two-story house with blue shutters and a small wraparound porch I'd built myself on weekends. Everything seemed fine at first. Neighbors waved politely, kids rode their bikes down the sidewalks, and the HOA newsletter always talked about preserving harmony. That phrase would soon feel ironic. The first sign of trouble came during my second week. A neatly folded notice appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA seal. It wasn't a welcome letter, it was a warning. According to the note, my front porch railing didn't meet the community's aesthetic uniformity guidelines. I remember reading it twice, trying not to laugh. It was sturdy, painted white, and blended perfectly with the rest of the house. But apparently, the wood grain I chose wasn't approved by the HOA's Architectural Review Board. I brushed it off. Every neighborhood had its rules, and maybe this was just their way of reminding new residents who ran things. That was before I learned who really ran things: Karen Daniels, the HOA president. Karen was a retired real estate agent in her late 50s, always dressed in bright floral blouses and wide-brimmed hats that matched her oversized sunglasses. She loved being in charge, and everyone knew it. Her word was law in Lake Ranch Estates. She chaired every meeting, personally signed every notice, and had no problem standing on someone's lawn to inspect what she called community violations. Most people didn't question her. They just complied. But something about her presence always carried a quiet tension, like people were scared to get on her bad side. I didn't think much of it until she showed up unannounced at my door one morning. She smiled tightly, clipboard in hand, and said she just wanted to introduce herself. But before I could invite her in, she launched into a lecture about HOA expectations, lawn maintenance schedules, and the importance of attending monthly meetings. She even hinted that responsible homeowners often volunteered for community roles. Her tone wasn't friendly, it was a test. I nodded politely, thanked her for stopping by, and said I'd read the community handbook later. That seemed to offend her. From that moment on, I could feel her eyes on me whenever I came or went. Weeks passed, and I started noticing subtle signs that I'd been marked. A small citation for improper trash bin placement. Another warning about my lawn length even, though I'd mowed it 2 days prior. At one point, a neighbor quietly warned me, "Just go along with her. Everyone does. It's easier." That advice bothered me more than the fines. Why was everyone afraid of one person? Then came the email invitation to an HOA meeting at the Lake Clubhouse. The subject line read, "Mandatory attendance, whole homeowners." I scanned through the agenda and saw nothing relevant to me. I was scheduled for a late-night patrol shift that same evening, so I replied that I couldn't make it but would review the minutes later. It seemed harmless enough, but apparently that decision didn't sit well with Karen. The next morning, I found another note taped to my door. "Failure to attend meetings reflects poorly on your commitment to the community. It read in bold print. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need to guess who sent it. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. And Karen didn't like when anyone didn't play along. I had no idea that skipping one meeting would trigger something so ridiculous that it would eventually make local headlines. But the signs were already there. Karen wasn't just running an HOA, she was running her own little kingdom. And she was about to find out that her authority ended the moment she tried to misuse it against the wrong person. It started small, almost laughably so. A notice about my porch railing turned into a warning about failure to comply. Then another letter arrived claiming my mailbox didn't meet the HOA's approved height standards. I measured it myself, was perfectly within code. Still, Karen insisted it needed to be adjusted for community aesthetics. Each note felt like a test, and every time I ignored it, the tone of her messages grew sharper, colder, more personal. At first, I tried to brush it off. I'd dealt with worse attitudes on the force. But it became clear that this wasn't ordinary HOA enforcement. It was targeted. Karen had singled me out. She didn't just want compliance. She wanted submission. A week after skipping that first meeting, I came home to find a fluorescent orange paper stuck to my door. Notice of fine $250 for no attendance. It was absurd. I'd checked the HOA bylaws. My self-attendance was encouraged, not mandatory. When I emailed the board asking for clarification, I didn't get a response from anyone but Karen. Her reply was short, sharp, and smug. Rules are rules. Chief, everyone must do their part to maintain community order. Something about the word chief stung differently. It wasn't respect, it was mockery. Somehow, she'd found out about my job and was using it to challenge me. The irony of being accused of disobedience by a woman who thought she ran a private government didn't escape me. The following week, I noticed her Koran old silver Lexus parked on the corner near my house every other morning. She'd sit there for 10, maybe 15 minutes, pretending to check her phone. But I knew she was watching. My wife even caught her taking photos of our yard one afternoon while pretending to walk her dog. That was the moment things turned personal. Days later, I received an HOA complaint claiming that I had left unauthorized equipment visible from the street. The equipment in question: my patrol cruiser parked in my driveway while I was home between shifts. Karen had cited a section of the guidelines stating that commercial or official vehicles, a coup, couldn't be left outside overnight. When I explained it was a department-issued vehicle and legally exempt, she replied, "The HOA doesn't make exceptions for anyone, especially not for appearances of favoritism." The audacity was infuriating. Other residents began noticing her behavior too. A few quietly approached me at the community mailbox or while walking their dogs, whispering things like, "She's gone after me." 2. Or you might want to be careful. It became clear that Karen had a pattern. She bullied those who pushed back. The problem was, I wasn't someone who scared easily. Still, she escalated. A letter arrived accusing me of violating noise ordinances after a small barbecue with friends. Then another one about grass height inconsistency, even though my lawn looked pristine. Each notice came with a fine $100 here, $150 there, adding up fast. She was building a paper trail, trying to wear me down with bureaucracy. But what she didn't realize was that I'd been documenting everything. I started keeping a log: dates, times, photos, emails, even footage from my doorbell camera. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. I knew people like Karen didn't stop when you ignored them. They stopped when you exposed them. Things reached a breaking point one Saturday morning when I returned home from a night shift to find 2 HOA board members standing in my yard with clipboards. They looked uncomfortable, like they didn't want to be there. When I asked what was going on, one muttered that Karen had requested a surprise inspection. Apparently, They were checking my landscaping for unapproved modifications. I reminded them that entering private property without consent was trespassing. They backed off immediately, apologizing before hurrying back to their cars. But I noticed Karen's Lexus parked nearby, her window slightly rolled down, watching the entire thing unfold. That's when I decided enough was enough. Over the next few days, I quietly reached out to a few other homeowners who'd complained about Karen's harassment. What I learned was worse than I expected. She'd been fining people for fabricated violations, rejecting improvement requests just to assert dominance, even threatening to tow cars parked in driveways overnight. She was running Lake Ranch Estates like a personal fiefdom, and most residents were too intimidated or tired to fight back. The final straw came when Karen called 911 on me. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was mowing my lawn. My cruiser was parked halfway up the driveway, just like always. I'd barely finished when 2 squad cars rolled up, lights flashing. I recognized one of the responding officers immediately. He was one of my own. He looked confused when I walked over, waving my badge. Apparently, Karen had told dispatch there was a man with a weapon acting suspiciously on her street. When they arrived and realized it was me, their faces said it all: embarrassment, disbelief, and frustration. Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, acting like she'd just performed a civic duty. The officers took her statement, apologized to me quietly, and left. She didn't even flinch. The next morning, an HOA letter arrived, another fine. This time for creating a disturbance and failing to uphold community safety standards. I couldn't believe it. She'd fabricated a police call just to write me up again. That's when I stopped reacting emotionally and started preparing strategically. I compiled every document, every recorded encounter, and every email into a single case file. Then, I reached out to the city attorney's office for a consultation, not as the police chief, but as a private homeowner. It didn't take long for them to see the pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. They suggested I file a formal complaint and pursue civil action if necessary. But before doing that, I wanted to make one thing clear to Karen and to the entire community. So, I requested to attend the next HOA board meeting. The moment the announcement went out, people buzzed. Attendance at these meetings usually averaged 5 or 6 residents, but that night, over 30 showed up. You could feel the tension in the air as Karen strutted to the front, clipboard in hand, wearing a bright pink blazer and her trademark oversized hat. She was smiling until she saw me sitting in the front row, arms folded, my badge clipped casually to my belt. "Thank you for joining us tonight," she said, her voice strained. "Let's begin with," I raised my hand before she could finish. "Actually," I said calmly, "I'd like to address something before we start." The room went silent. Karen's smile faltered. "I've spent the last several weeks documenting multiple instances of HOA misconduct," I continued. "Unauthorized property inspections, fabricated fines, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds. I've compiled evidence, and I'll be forwarding it to the city attorney for review. But out of respect for the community, I thought you should all hear it first." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face flushed red as she tried to interject, but I wasn't finished. I handed a folder to one of the board members sitting beside her. "Every date, every notice, every false claim, it's all there. And before you deny it, there's also footage of you and your board members entering my property without consent." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She knew I wasn't bluffing. The silence stretched so long you could hear the air conditioner hum. Residents shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. I looked around the room and saw something I hadn't seen before, people realizing they didn't have to be afraid of her anymore. That night was the turning point. But the fallout that followed would be far more dramatic than anyone expected. Karen wasn't done fighting. She was about to make one last desperate move that would expose just how far she was willing to go to keep her power. And that move would be her undoing, The night of the final confrontation began like any other, quiet, tense, and heavy, with that strange calm before a storm. The fallout from the last HOA meeting had spread like wildfire through Lake Ranch Estates. Word of Karen's abuses had leaked into every group chat and morning walk conversation. For the first time in years, people were questioning her authority. And Karen, she didn't take it well. Over the next week, she doubled down. New compliance notices appeared on doors, mostly targeting those who'd spoken up. She called emergency meetings, rewrote minor bylaws, and even tried to suspend board members who refused to back her. It was desperation wrapped in authority, and everyone could see it cracking. But I stayed silent, watching and waiting. I knew she'd make a mistake big enough to expose herself completely. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was on duty when I received a dispatch call for a disturbance at Lake Ranch Estates. The location: my own house. My gut twisted as I sped back, lights flashing. When I arrived, I saw 3 police units already parked outside. My wife stood in the driveway, visibly shaken, while Karen stood across the street with her phone raised, recording everything like it was her personal reality show. "She trespassed onto our property," my wife said, voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "She tried to take pictures inside the garage, apparently." Karen had shown up that morning claiming to be conducting an HOA investigation into unauthorized modifications. When my wife refused to let her inside, Karen called 911 again, claiming she was being obstructed from enforcing community safety regulations. The responding officers, unfamiliar with the ongoing situation, treated it as a civil dispute until I arrived. I stepped out of my cruiser, the badge on my chest glinting under the sunlight. Karen froze mid-sentence, phone still in hand. "Oh," she stammered, her voice faltering for the first time. "Chief, I didn't realize this was your residence." I walked toward her slowly, calm but cold. "You knew exactly whose house this was, Karen." The officers watched in silence as I explained the situation, showing them documentation from the previous harassment reports and the city attorney's correspondence. Karen tried to interject, babbling about community authority and visual inspections, but it was over. She had just trespassed onto private property under false pretenses and weaponized 911 again. Except this time, there were witnesses, recordings, and a paper trail. As protocol demanded, the officers documented the incident and took Karen's statement. "I didn't interfere. I didn't need to." She was digging her own grave with every word. When the officers finally left, she turned to me, voice low and venomous. "You think you can scare me just because you wear that badge?" I met her glare evenly. "No, Karen, I don't have to scare you." The truth already did. That night, I filed an official report, forwarding every piece of evidence, including her recorded confrontations, to the city attorney's office and the Department of Housing. Within days, an investigation into the Lake Ranch HOA was formally launched. Board members began resigning one by one, unwilling to go down with her. But Karen still showed up to every meeting, clutching her clipboard like a shield, trying to maintain control. The next HOA gathering wasn't like the others. The community center was packed, standing room only. News had spread about the investigation, and people came not just to listen, but to watch justice unfold. Karen entered late, her usual confidence reduced to forced smiles and trembling hands. She still tried to act composed, but her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for an exit. I sat in the front row again, silent, waiting for her to start. "Thank you all for attending," she said, voice shaky but defiant. "I know there have been rumors, but I assure you, everything is under control. The HOA remains strong, and any claims of misconduct are false," I said sharply, cutting her off. She froze. I stood and pulled out a manila envelope, identical to the one I'd handed over weeks ago, But this time, I had something new. I placed it on the table beside her clipboard. That's the preliminary report from the city attorney's office. It details multiple violations of state housing law, unlawful fines, misuse of HOA funds, and unauthorized surveillance of residents. It also includes testimony from 7 homeowners. They've all confirmed what you've been doing. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's face went pale. "You can't, this isn't public record," I said, cutting her off again. "The investigation findings are public as of this morning. And according to that report, you're being referred for potential criminal charges: fraud, harassment, and misuse of emergency services." A sharp gasp echoed across the room. Some people actually clapped, unable to contain their relief. Karen tried to speak, but her voice broke into a shrill stammer. You can't do this to me. I built this community." I stepped closer. "No, Karen, you controlled it. You turned it into your kingdom. But that ends tonight." The room erupted in murmurs, then applause. Another member seconded the motion without hesitation. Karen's jaw dropped, and she spun toward them in disbelief. "You can't vote me out. I am the board." Derek shook his head. "You were the board. Not anymore." It took less than 2 minutes for the vote to pass. Karen was officially removed from her position effective that moment. The woman who had spent years terrorizing her neighbors, fining families for trivial details, and bending rules to feed her ego, stood alone in front of the very people she'd tried to control. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, her bright pink blazer looking almost comically out of place against the silence. When she finally looked up, her eyes met mine one last time. There was no arrogance left, just fury, shame, and something that almost resembled fear. "You think you've won," she hissed under her breath as she passed by me. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. As she stormed out of the community center, someone in the back called out, "Don't forget your clipboard, Karen." Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension that had hung over Lake Ranch Estates for months. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was the sound of relief, of liberation. When the door slammed behind her, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. The battle was over. The community had its peace back. But deep down, I knew this story wasn't quite finished, not yet. The legal process still had to unfold, and Karen's actions had consequences that would echo beyond this neighborhood. Still, for the first time in a long while, Lake Ranch Estates felt alive again. Neighbors talked freely, kids played on lawns without fear of violations, and people began to rebuild what she had broken: a sense of trust. As the meeting dispersed, several residents came up to shake my hand, thanking me for standing up not just for myself, but for everyone she'd bullied. One older gentleman said something that stuck with me. "You didn't just protect this neighborhood, Chief. You gave it back to us." Driving home that night, the streets felt different, lighter, freer. For months, Karen had turned this place into a cage of paranoia and petty control. Now, it finally felt like home again. But as I pulled into my driveway, headlights flashed in my rear-view mirror. A car idled at the corner, and old silver Lexus. For a moment, my pulse spiked. Then, slowly, it drove away into the night. Karen was gone. Or so I thought. The investigation was just beginning, and what it uncovered next would shake more than just our quiet little neighborhood. It would reveal how far one person could go when given too much power, and how fragile community becomes when fear replaces fairness. The weeks that followed Karen's removal were some of the most surreal and satisfying days Lake Ranch Estates had seen in years. For the first time in a long time, the air around the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer, almost hopeful. The same people who used to peek through their blinds during HOA inspections now greeted each other on their morning walks. Neighbors began repainting their mailboxes, planting flowers again. even hosting small gatherings in their driveways without worrying about a letter taped to their door the next morning. But beneath that newfound calm, the legal machinery was quietly turning. The city attorney's office had formally opened its investigation. And because of Karen's repeated misuse of her HOA authority, several state housing violations came to light. The emails, fines, fake citations, and 911 calls all painted a picture of a woman who had built a small empire of control and, finally, that empire was crumbling. A few weeks later, I received a notice to testify. The hearing wasn't just about Karen. It was about setting a precedent for accountability in homeowners associations statewide. Apparently, Lake Ranch Estates wasn't the only community dealing with overreaching, self-appointed mini-monarchs. Our case had caught the attention of regional housing officials, and for the first time, people wanted to use it to create real change. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, I didn't come as a police chief. I came as a resident, as someone who'd been on the receiving end of her abuse. The courtroom was full residents, board members, even representatives from other HOAs watching closely. Karen sat at the front, her once perfect posture slumped, her signature bright blazer replaced with a plain gray jacket. She looked smaller somehow, the sharpness in her eyes dulled by exhaustion. The evidence was overwhelming. The city attorney presented the 911 call recordings, showing how Karen had fabricated emergencies to enforce petty HOA rules. They showed her entering private property without consent, imposing unauthorized fines, and forging signatures on internal HOA approvals. Each revelation chipped away at the image she'd tried so hard to maintain. When the judge asked her why she'd done it, why she felt the need to control every part of her community, her answer was chillingly simple. "I just wanted things to be perfect," she said quietly, "and nobody else cared enough to make them that way." It was the first time anyone had seen her without that performative bravado. Just a woman consumed by obsession, convinced that order meant power. The court ruled decisively. Karen was barred from holding any HOA or community administrative position for life. She was fined heavily for harassment, trespassing, and misuse of emergency services. Additionally, the HOA itself was placed under temporary supervision, with the state housing department stepping in to restructure the board and audit its finances. When the gavel struck, a wave of relief rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't just justice for me, it was closure for everyone she'd targeted, humiliated, or silenced. After the verdict, Karen avoided public attention, retreating from the neighborhood entirely. Her house eventually went up for sale quietly, with no announcement. A for sale sign appeared one morning, and within weeks, she was gone. The pink azaleas she'd once insisted every houseplant wilted in her absence, untended and forgotten. The new board, led by Derek and 2 other longtime residents, immediately began dismantling the toxic culture she'd built. They rewrote the bylaws, limited the board's power, and introduced community votes for major decisions. One of the first changes was symbolic but powerful, removing the old surveillance-style HOA cameras Karen had installed. The day those were taken down, the neighborhood erupted in cheers. Kids drew chalk on the sidewalks again, and people stayed outside long past sunset, talking, laughing, existing without fear of a warning letter. For me, life slowly returned to normal, as normal as it could after months of tension and confrontation. The uniform I wore to serve and protect had taken on new meaning. I'd always believed in justice, but this experience reminded me that sometimes the worst abuse doesn't come from criminals, comes from people who convince themselves they're doing the right thing. A few weeks later, I was invited to a community barbecue hour, first one in years. The smell of grilled food filled the air, and the sound of laughter echoed through the cul-de-sac. Someone raised a glass and said, "To new beginnings, standing up when it matters." It hit me harder than I expected. Standing there, surrounded by people who had once been divided by fear. I realized this wasn't just about one woman's downfall. It was about the power of a community rediscovering itself after years of quiet submission. It was about people remembering that fairness, kindness, and courage don't come from authority, they come from each other. Still, in the quiet moments, I couldn't help but think about Karen. For all her cruelty, part of me wondered if she ever truly understood what she'd lost. Power is intoxicating. It makes people feel invincible, righteous. But when that illusion breaks, it leaves behind nothing but emptiness. Months later, I learned she'd moved to another state, far from Lake Ranch Estates. Rumor had it she tried joining another HOA, only to be rejected after her history became known. I didn't celebrate that. I just hoped, somewhere deep down, she'd learned something about limits, about respect, about what real community means. Meanwhile, Lake Ranch transformed in ways none of us expected. The board's new policies encouraged volunteer work, open discussion, and transparency. Fines became rare, meetings became productive, and trusts slowly but surely returned. One afternoon, as I walked past the community center, I noticed a new sign on the wall. Community isn't control, it's connection. Simple, honest, perfect. A few local journalists later covered our story, using it as an example of HOA reform done right. They called it the Lake Ranch turnaround, and soon, other neighborhoods began reaching out for guidance. Derek started hosting informational meetings, helping neighboring HOAs avoid the same mistakes. It was strange, really, how something so bitter and exhausting could turn into something good. But that's the thing about conflict. When handled right, it doesn't just end. It transforms. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught me more than any badge ever could. It taught me that silence enables bullies, that rules without empathy become weapons, and that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone until others find the courage to stand with you. Lake Ranch Estates wasn't perfect after Karen's fall. No community ever is, but it was finally free. And that's what mattered. As months rolled into a year, I'd occasionally drive through the neighborhood late at night after finishing a shift. Porch lights glowed softly. Kids' bikes leaned against fences, and the faint hum of laughter drifted from patios. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes not from fear or order, but from trust. Every now and then, I'd glance at Karen's old house. The new family there had repainted it, replaced the flowers, and filled it with life again. You'd never know the kind of chaos that once lived behind those walls. And maybe that was for the best. Some stories aren't meant to linger forever. They're meant to teach, to warn, and then to fade. But as I'd turn the corner toward home, I'd always think of that one day, the moment Karen realized her power was gone. Not because someone shouted louder, but because truth spoke for itself. That's the part that still stays with me. Not the conflict, not the headlines, but the quiet, unshakable reminder that in every neighborhood, every community, every group, there's a line between leadership and control. And when someone crosses it, it takes only one person brave enough to push back for everything to change. Because sometimes the greatest justice doesn't come from the courtroom or a badge. It comes from a neighborhood that finally remembers what it means to belong to one another. And that's how Lake Ranch Estates, once ruled by fear, became something stronger than ever before. A community reborn through accountability, courage, and truth.